Hello, I'm Stephan Schwartz, and it's a pleasure to speak with you again. Welcome to the Schwartz Report. Today, I want to talk about something that is becoming increasingly concerning for me, and I suspect for you as well, and that is white Christian nationalism. This idea that we need to have an authoritarian government that enforces Christianity, because we are supposedly founded as a Christian country. I hear this all the time from politicians now and from various commentators. So I want to talk about, as I emphasize in all of these podcasts, I want to talk about facts, not political partisanship, not political philosophy. I want to talk about facts. How did we get to this point where we have such strong threats? And I mean, election workers are quitting because of the threats. Judges, prosecutors, attorneys have to have professional security to go out to the grocery store. I mean, it's crazy. So I want to talk today about how we got to this point and what we need to do, I think, to deal with it. Well, to start out with, according to the Public Religion Research Institute and the Brookings Institute, who did a study on this and who do a lot of research on this subject, only 10% of Americans view themselves as adherents of Christian nationalism, and about 19% are sympathetic with it. So that's about just a little under a third of Americans believe this, that we are a Christian country and that that's what the founders intended. In fact, that's not at all what the founders intended, but I'm going to try to get into how we got to this. Half of Christian nationalism adherents and nearly 4 in 10 sympathizers with Christian nationalism, a little difference between being deeply committed and simply being sympathetic, say they support the idea of an authoritarian leader in order to keep these Christian values in society. You're beginning to see in the media, in commentary, discussions and projections of the Red Caesar, an authoritarian figure who will enforce this. It's very disturbing. The Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI as it's generally known, ran a survey with the Brookings Institute to try to get a better handle on this again. And they asked the question, do you agree or disagree that God intended America to be a new promised land where European Christians could create a society that could be an example to the rest of the world? Actually, I find a rather strange question, but in any case, the survey found that while only 3 in 10 Americans agree with this statement, majorities of Republicans, 52%, and even more white evangelical Protestants affirm this, that God intended America to be a promised land for European Christians. Well, let's actually now take a look at how we actually got to this. And I'm going to talk about some stuff. And again, this is facts, not philosophy or political partisanship. How we got to this in the first place, this idea of white Christian nationalism. If you look at the research, what you see is that I think this is partly baked into us genetically. And the reason is that for about 5,400 years, which is essentially the equivalent of modern, well, not modern, but recorded history. So for about 5,400 years, there were multiple hominid species coexisting on the earth. Neanderthal, Denisovan, and they fought, and they also intermarried or interbred, particularly in Asia and Europe, not so much or not in Africa, but in Asia and Europe today, not unusual for a person to have about 4% of their genetic makeup tracing back to Neanderthal. So I think this all starts when there were multiple hominid species and you were coming over a hill and you saw somebody on the other side on another hill, and you ask yourself, are these part of my species, my group, or is this something else? And it, over a period of the 5,000 years, almost 6, just got bred in the same way that cultures alter themselves by the choices that they make. If, for instance, you look at the number of Nobel Prize winners, you'll find that there's a strong predisposition to Jews. Now, why is that? And the answer is that because for 1,000 years more, Jews were not allowed to own property, hold positions of power in the government or anything like that. And what they did was, because they were always a persecuted minority, what they could do is get into banking and trading and things like that. And so it became very important for a family to marry their sons or their daughters to highly intelligent people who could succeed at this sort of activity. And it skewed, literally altered the culture. And as I say, if you look at the Nobel Prize, particularly in the sciences, you will find there is a disposition for Jewish winners. Not because it has anything to do with their religion in the sense that religion confers genetics, but because culturally, over a very long period of time, they chose to emphasize specific traits. But let me get back also to where all of this started in North America. When Columbus got back from his first voyage in the 4th of March, 1493, he came back to Portugal and reported what he had seen and what he had observed. And that began what has come to be known in the sciences as the doctrine of discovery. And it began as a result of the fights that the Roman Catholic Church, which was both a political power and a religious power in Europe, and with its fights particularly with the Muslims. And about 41 years before Columbus got back from the New World, Pope Nicholas, on the 18th of June in 1452, issued a bull, an edict, in which he said to invade and search out and capture and vanquish and subdue all Saracens, Muslims, and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ whatsoever, placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all the movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by these people, that they could be captured and reduced to persons of perpetual slavery. And that set a cultural choice. What I'm suggesting to you here is, although this was done in religious terms, it really was a cultural matter of the Europeans in their fights with Muslims, particularly in Spain and Portugal, that they took a position that if they could capture any of these people, that they could reduce them to slavery. And that idea, which began in 1452, when Columbus came back and talked about the indigenous peoples that he had encountered, resulted in Pope Alexander VI issuing what came to be known as the Inter Se Terra. And in that, he said that the express task of the exploration of the New World should be to affirm Christianity, Roman Christianity, by the way, although today it's mostly Protestant, at that time, Roman Catholic, and he affirmed the church's blessings and interest in political conquest, and said that in our times, especially the Catholic faith and the Christian religion, be exalted and be everywhere increased and spread, and that the health of souls be cared for, and that barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself. This is all part of this doctrine of discovery. So from the very beginning of Europeans coming to North America, the idea was to overpower any other culture, any other peoples that they found. And that these were to be subjugated. And of course, that's exactly what happened. Look at what happened to the Native Americans, for instance. Look at what happened with slavery. The idea that we could own individuals. Now, I think that is so foreign that it's difficult for people today to really understand that. Just try to imagine for a moment thinking that you could own a human being like you owned a dog or a horse, and that they were entirely subordinate to anything you wanted because they were lesser beings. And this was a huge part of the founding of the colonies in what today is the United States. I just don't think people get this. I don't think people really understand, for instance, that a majority of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were slave owners. There's a little argument about a couple of them, but 41 of the 56 signers of the Declaration owned slaves and thought it was perfectly okay to own individuals like dogs or horses or goats or sheep. And about half the delegates of the Constitutional Convention, 1787, also owned slaves. 4 of the first 5 presidents of the United States, the only exception being John Adams, were slave owners. This idea that white European Christians were a superior race and that they were entitled to own other individuals or to take over their lands. Look at what happened to the Native Americans. We call the white Christians pioneers and people that were willing to go out to the frontiers. But in fact, what they were doing was pushing a whole other population of people who had been there for thousands of years off their lands. The Trail of Tears, for instance, the movement of Native Americans off their lands, Custer's Last Stand, all that sort of thing. So white Christian nationalism, from the very beginning of this country, was a kind of poisonous ethno-political religious operation, and it was reflected in the symbols and then the popular dramatics, the theaters, the songs, the stories people told, and it became baked into the culture. Now, people like Ron DeSantis and other white Christian fascists, they don't want to talk about this. They want to talk about, oh, slaves actually benefited from slavery. Think about that for a second. You're whoever you are, and you're owned by somebody. You're a woman, and a person who owns you comes in and says, I want to have sex with you. You don't have any ability to say, I don't want to do that. You're a man, and they say, I want you to go do this physically dangerous work or whatever. And you have nothing you can say about that. So from the very beginning, this idea of white Christian nationalism was baked into the country. And it slowly began to dissipate and diminish. The Civil War, of course, the Civil Rights Movement. But it has been reactivated as a political tool by far-right people, the maggot world, the far right of the Republican Party. It's become central to the trajectory of the contemporary Republican Party, 2/3 of whom identify as white and Christian. So we have this problem in which we, for a whole host of reasons dating back thousands of years, we have this idea that one group is more superior than another group, and that they have a right to dominate and take what they want from anyone else. Now, what are we going to do about this? I think it's not just that this is where we are. White nationalist, white Christian nationalism is the leading cause of terrorism in the United States. It's not immigrants. It's not Muslims. It's white Christian nationalists, the Proud Boys, the 3%ers, the whatever. These groups which are violent and who are causing violence in this country. In Idaho, there's a group that are trying to they want to create their own state within the country, the Aryan Nation. So it's become a huge problem and is causing enormous violence, and it is threatening the very existence of our democracy. So the question is, what do we do? And the answer, I think, is that we make decisions about people on the basis of their character, their beingness, not the color of their skin. That we choose who we will deal with, not because of the color of their skin, but because they have a character which is fostering of well-being, that they choose things which foster well-being and that are compassionate and life-affirming. When you look at what is going on in this country, we are becoming two countries. A red country, the blue country. I've discussed this before. You can see it in the healthcare for women, what's happening in the red states where healthcare for women is degenerating down or degrading down to places where there are medical deserts, and a woman who wants to have a child can't even find an OBGYN because they've all left as a result of the post-Dobbs decision. I've discussed this before. And I think what we are being challenged with is we are now facing the largest existential crisis humanity has ever faced, and that is climate change. And what it is going to do is catastrophic in many areas. The only way we're going to get through this, I think, without literally becoming a culture that we don't even recognize, is that we have got to decide to choose. All our decisions must be choosing the option that is the most compassionate, life-affirming, and fostering of well-being. That we don't make racial decisions. We don't assume things about people because they're not our religion. And by the way, the founders, George Mason, would not sign the Constitution because he said, if we don't end the slave trade, we are going to have a civil war. And in fact, of course, that's exactly what happened. Benjamin Franklin, when he died, was the president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. So there were early founders who already understood this. And I think the challenge to America is that we must make our decisions and our policies on the basis of equality of gender, race, and religion, and that we associate with, we involve ourselves with people who represent, through the choices that they make, compassionate, life-affirming, fostering of well-being decisions. This is something that has to happen at the individual level, because this is a cultural problem, and culture is created by individual choices. As I have said before, that's why the Japanese and the Italians cook eggplants differently. That's why religions have different symbols and things. Those are cultural choices, and they occur and become powerful because of individual choices. And so this is an issue that must be solved at the individual level. And the question I want to leave you with, and I think you should look deeply into yourself, discuss it with your friends and family, is how do I, as an individual, support compassionate, life-affirming, fostering of well-being policies and decisions that emphasize equality and the nature of an individual's beingness, not the color of their skin or their religion. It's our choice. And the world we're going to live in is going to be however we choose. You could see in the throwing McCarthy out of the speakership the kind of struggles that are going on, the fact that our Congress is virtually dysfunctional. All of this is a result of the voters putting into office individuals who create not governance that is functional, but fighting on things like race or religion or gender equality. So the choice is yours and mine, and what we choose is going to create the world our children and their children live in. Thank you.